The origins of the motorcycle fly screen seem to be shrouded in mystery. No one seems to have written anything down, so the question of who, when and where doesn't seem to exist. But it is generally accepted that they appeared in the clubman scene. Racing enthusiasts and privateers that didn't have the big budgets of the GP racers and had to make do with what they could fashion themselves. It had long been established that laying flat on your tank peering over the top of your clocks offered less wind resistance, and on the straights it allowed you to squeeze another 3 or 4 miles per hour out of your machine. The fly screen developed from there, a small, easily fashioned device that allowed a cleaner airflow over the rider and reduced drag even further. Now, the term windscreen and fly screen are often used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. Windscreens are for big girls' blouses that don't like the wind, and fly screens are for men, real men, that want to travel at speed for longer. The effects of a fly screen are subtle. A properly designed screen will move the wind blast off your torso and your chest up to shoulder height, still allowing the air to move around the helmet, but it should be clean air. The right design shouldn't cause turbulence and helmet buffeting. Now, the absolute effect that a well-designed fly screen has is going to vary from rider to rider, motorcycle to motorcycle, and also depends on the direction of the prevailing winds. But as a general rule of thumb, a rider should be able to expect about a 20% reduction in wind force against his body. This takes stress off his shoulders and his hands and allows him to ride at speeds of between, say, 40 miles an hour and 70 miles an hour for longer before fatigue causes him to pull over and take a break. And the Royal Enfield long fly screen fits this description perfectly. I've got no complaints, it does exactly what it should do. I did, of course, look at alternatives to the Royal Enfield screen. The cheap and cheerful Puig screens designed for modern Japanese bikes, to my discerning eye, doesn't look right on a modern classic. And the Dart screen, made by a company that professes to make the original fly screen, even though they didn't start trading until 1995, which is about 45 years after fly screens first appeared. I'd learnt my lesson with the Dart screen back when I bought the T120. Questionable quality and design, brackets that damage your paintwork, and a customer care response that stated the damage caused was my fault because I followed their manufacturer's instructions. So I wasn't going down that road again. Now, this Royal Enfield screen caught my eye when I test rode the Interceptor back in May of this year. It is a very high quality piece, and the design reminded me of the National Cycle brand products, with its quality injection moulded screen and the brushed stainless steel trim at the bottom, although obviously in this case it bears Royal Enfield's name. With the included brackets, it fits properly. It's steady, there's minimal vibration, and once fitted, Royal Enfield have made sure that there's sufficient space between the clocks and the screen for easy cleaning, something that a lot of screen manufacturers don't take into account. Fitting is quite simple and straightforward, although I have heard some people complain about its complexity. But the reality is that with a few simple tools, it's a 25-minute job, and I'll quickly take you through the process. Now, the screen comes in kit form and it is nicely packaged, and inside the box you'll find the actual screen itself, the stainless steel trim, 2 extra long headlamp fixing bolts, 4 smaller Allen bolts, a pack of 4 rubber grommets, and the 2 fixing brackets. Now, I have to be honest, I used the instructions for reference only just to see how the screen was assembled. The writing is very small. They've squeezed a lot of information into a very small pamphlet. I just used the instructions to get the gist of how everything went together and then basically just did my own thing. So if you find yourself doing this job and what I've shown you here differs from the instructions, that's the reason for it, although I will say I didn't encounter any problems doing it my way. Now the first thing you need to do is obviously assemble the screen. At the bottom of the screen there are 4 holes in 2 rows. The first thing you need to do is insert your rubber grommets evenly into these. Be careful, because if you drop them you'll probably never see them again. Make sure that they're seated properly on both sides around the plastic. That is important if you want to avoid cracking the screen while you're assembling it. Once they're in place, put your stainless steel trim onto the front of the screen, and then using those smaller Allen bolts, insert them through the trim plate, through the screen and into the captive nuts on your fixing brackets, making sure of course that you have the fixing brackets on the right way. Basically what it does is it sandwiches the actual screen itself between the trim plate and the brackets, using those rubber grommets to cushion and evenly disperse the pressure of the fasteners, so you get a good solid fixing with all the parts without any danger of damaging the screen. Once you've done that, put the screen to one side somewhere safe where it's not going to fall and get damaged, and it's time to get to work on the bike. Before you start disassembling things on your bike, the first thing you should do is take a towel or a large microfiber cloth, something like that, and wrap it over your front mudguard to protect it from scratching. Because at some stage you are going to be resting parts of the headlamp assembly on it. Plus there's also a danger you might drop a screwdriver or a spanner or something like that, and it needs some protection. Then take a long shafted posi-drive screwdriver and loosen off the screw at the top of the headlamp bowl. The need for a long screwdriver will become more apparent later on when we're putting everything back together. Now don't unscrew this screw all the way. Basically it just engages onto a clamp that holds the bezel onto the headlamp bowl. Just do a few turns at a time until you can prise the bezel off, because if you unscrew it too far, that clamp will actually become detached and then there's a danger of losing it. When you've got the headlamp bezel and the lens free, just allow them to dangle in front of the headlamp. Once you've done that, trace the wires from each of your indicators through into the headlamp bowl to the 2-pin block connectors that connect them up to the wiring loom. You'll find it's a white block connector for the right hand indicator and a black block connector for the left hand indicator. Now these are the older click lock type connectors. Disconnect them. You might find that you'll need gentle persuasion from a flat bladed screwdriver just to prise the lock apart to get them to disconnect. And when you've done that, pull the connectors back through the holes in the back of the headlamp bowl so that they're dangling free, ready to remove your indicators. Once those wires are free from the headlamp bowl, unfasten the bolts that hold the headlamp bowl onto the headlamp brackets, and you can just leave it dangling. This now gives you free access to the bolts that hold the indicators in place. Using an appropriate spanner, a ratcheting ring spanner is good if you have one. Then unfasten the indicators and remove them from the bike, taking care of course not to damage the block connectors as you feed them through the holes in the headlamp bracket. You can then offer your flyer screen up to the headlamp bracket. The brackets on the flyer screen actually engage onto the outside of the headlamp bracket, and it might be an idea just to thread the headlamp fixing bolts through once you've got the screen brackets in place, just to hold them there while you'll get to work fastening the indicators back on. Now remember, your right hand indicator has the white block connector on it and the left hand indicator has the black block connector on it. Don't get them mixed up. Now the indicator mounts do have a cutout in the bottom of them that makes sure that you get them the right way up, and they also ensure that you put the indicators on at the right angle, so there's no need to mess around lining them up. Fully tighten your indicators in place and then carefully thread the wires back through the holes in the rear of the headlamp bowl, routing them carefully as close as you possibly can to how they were before you started. Then reconnect them, and remember it's white to white and black to black. You can then go ahead and replace the headlamp bowl onto the headlamp mounts. Now I used the extended bolts that actually came with a fly screen kit, but on reflection I think I could probably have managed with the original bolts because the replacements did seem a little bit overlong once everything was in place to me. It's entirely up to you which you use. So each of the two bolts goes through the fly screen mounting bracket, through the headlamp bracket, and then into the captive nuts inside the headlamp. Tighten them up reasonably tight, but don't fully retighten them at this stage because you're probably going to need to readjust the headlamp. Once they're in place, it's time to reinstall the headlamp bezel and lens assembly. And this is where the longer screwdriver comes in because obviously the screen is in the way now. And a long screwdriver just makes access to that screw on the top easier. Once your lens assembly is back in place, switch on your ignition and check to make sure that your left and right indicator are working correctly and that your headlamp's working correctly. At this point, it's also a good idea just to check your headlamp alignment and then go ahead and fully tighten those mounting bolts back up. And that's basically all there is to it. It's half an hour's work at most. So that's the first of the Royal Enfield accessories fitted to the Interceptor. I have got more coming up in the next few weeks, including the sump guard and the compact crash bars. I'm also going to be doing the first service myself, which will be coming up in the next week or so. On top of that, it's 2 years since I did a full how-to bike cleaning video, so I'm going to have to revisit that before too long as well. Lots of interesting stuff coming up, so please subscribe to this channel if you don't want to miss it. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have, please hit that like button. I will of course be back next week, so until then, please ride safely and I'll see you soon.